Story. CEO laughs at single dad's repair shop. Request until he fixed 47 unfixable luxury cars. Worth $34 million. Legacy auto didn't smell like money. It smelled like work. It was an honest smell, woven from decades of motor oil, the sharp tang of metal shavings, the faint aroma of stale coffee, and something deeper, the scent of persistence. The two-bay garage, tucked away on a side street that progress had mostly forgotten, was David Miller's entire world. It was small, cluttered, and to an outsider, perhaps a little grimy, but to David it was perfect. Every tool had its place. The sockets were arranged in neat, gleaming rows. The wrenches, worn smooth by 2 generations of calloused hands, hung on a pegboard like silver silhouettes. Some were older than David himself, their steel bearing the faint initials FM Frank Miller. His father. The heart of the garage was a large, framed photograph hanging on the office wall, safe from the spray of grease and grime. In it, a younger, brighter-eyed David stood beside his father. Both men were covered in dirt, grinning from ear to ear, their arms slung around each other in front of the very same garage. The sign above them, freshly painted back then, read, Miller and Son Auto. When his father passed, David had it professionally changed to Legacy Auto. The weight of that word felt heavier every year. The sputtering cough of a 20-year-old sedan pulled David from his thoughts. Mrs. Gable's ancient Buick rattled into the bay, wheezing like an old man climbing a flight of stairs. She was one of his last remaining regulars from his father's time, a sweet woman with a pension that barely covered her groceries. "It's making that noise again, David," she said, her voice thin with worry as she stepped out of the car. "The one that sounds like a box of angry squirrels." David smiled, a warm, genuine expression that softened the tired lines around his eyes. "Let's have a listen to those squirrels, Martha." He didn't hook the car up to a fancy diagnostic tablet right away. Instead, he simply asked her to start it again. He closed his eyes, tilted his head, and listened. It wasn't just a job for him, it was a conversation. His father had taught him that every engine tells a story. You just had to be patient enough to hear it. The rhythmic thump-thump of the engine was off, punctuated by a high-pitched metallic whine. It wasn't the alternator, as a lesser mechanic might guess. It was deeper. "It's the water pump bearing," he said after a moment, opening his eyes. "It's about to give up. Good thing you brought it in." He spent the next 2 hours working with a focused intensity that was almost meditative. His movements were efficient, precise, born of thousands of hours spent in the guts of machinery. While he worked, his daughter Lily sat on a clean, overturned tire crate in the corner, a small island of calm in the organized chaos. At 7 years old, she was the true owner of his heart, the engine that drove him through the long days and longer nights. A sketchpad rested on her lap. She was drawing, tongue stuck out in concentration, her brow furrowed. "Whatcha making, sweetie?" David asked, his voice slightly muffled as he reached deep into the engine bay. "It's Wrench Man," she announced proudly, holding it up. The drawing showed a stick figure with a determined look, wearing a cape that looked suspiciously like a red shop rag. In one hand, the figure held a comically oversized wrench, ready to fight automotive evil wherever it lurked. David chuckled, his chest swelling with a love so fierce it almost hurt. "That's my new favorite superhero." "Wrench Man can fix anything," Lily said, a statement of pure, unshakable faith. He finally extracted the faulty water pump and held it up. "Well, he just fixed Mrs. Gable's car." He wiped his hands and walked over to her, ruffling her hair. "Almost anything anyway." "What can't he fix?" she asked, her big brown eyes looking up at him. David knelt, his gaze softening. "A broken heart, sweetie. That's about the only thing." An hour later, Mrs. Gable returned, her purse clutched tightly in her hands. David had the Buick purring like a kitten. "Oh, David, it sounds wonderful," she said, relief washing over her face. "Now what do I owe you?" David did the math in his head. The part, his labor, it came out to just over $300. He saw the flicker of anxiety in her eyes, and his heart sank. He knew she didn't have it. He pretended to consult his clipboard, tapping a pen against it thoughtfully. "Well, the part wasn't as much as I thought, and you know, I had an old gasket that fit perfectly, so we saved some money there. Let's just call it an even $150. The gratitude on her face was worth more than the money he'd just lost. "Oh, bless you, David. You're a good boy, just like your father." He just smiled and waved as she drove away, the smooth sound of her engine a small victory in a losing war. The cash she paid him wouldn't even cover the electric bill. As the sun began to dip below the rooftops, casting long shadows across the garage floor, the mail carrier dropped a stack of envelopes through the mail slot in the office door. David scooped them up, sorting through them with a practiced, weary motion. Junk, junk. A bill for shop supplies. Another bill, and then he saw it. It was a long, white envelope, but it had a bold red stripe across the top. His stomach tightened into a cold knot. It was from the bank. He'd been dreading this for months, ever since the last loan extension had been denied. His hands trembled slightly as he tore it open. The formal, unforgiving print seemed to leap off the page. Final notice of foreclosure. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in the immediate seizure and liquidation of the property located at 14 Industrial Drive. 30 days. The air rushed out of his lungs. He felt dizzy, leaning against the workbench for support. 30 days. In the garage, his father's garage, his legacy, his entire life would be gone. He stared at the photograph on the wall, at his father's proud, smiling face. A wave of shame so profound it felt like drowning washed over him. He had failed him. "Daddy, are you okay?" He turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, her drawing clutched in her hand. He had to shield her from this. He had to be her rock, even if he felt like he was crumbling into sand. He forced a smile, tucking the letter swiftly into his back pocket. "I'm great, sweetie, just tired. Long day with those angry squirrels, you know. Go on and wash up. I'll close up shop and we'll get some dinner." She seemed to accept it, skipping off toward the small washroom in the back. The moment she was out of sight, David's smile vanished. He slumped onto a stool, burying his face in his stained hands. What could he do? Get another loan? No one would give him one. Sell the classic tools? They were worth more in sentiment than cash. He felt utterly, completely trapped. As he sat there, shrouded in the dimming light, a car whispered past the open garage door. It was silent, sleek, and impossibly black. A brand new Sterling Peregrine, a car that cost more than David made in 3 years. It was a symbol of everything he wasn't. Successful, modern, wealthy. It was the kind of car he'd never get to work on. The kind of owner who would never step foot in a place like Legacy Auto. Then, an idea sparked in the darkness of his despair. An insane, desperate, and utterly terrifying idea. He knew about Sterling Automotive. Every mechanic did. Their cars were engineering marvels, technological masterpieces. They were also notoriously, legendarily, flawed. They were plagued with bizarre electronic gremlins and recurring mechanical issues that even the company's own elite technicians, with all their advanced computers, often couldn't fix. He'd heard the stories from parts suppliers of pristine, low-mileage cars being written off because no one could solve the puzzle. And he knew about the man who ran the company, Jonathan Sterling, a titan of industry, a genius. An arrogant billionaire who was infamous for his obsession with his company's image of perfection. Nothing would be more infuriating to a man like that than the word unfixable. It was a 1 in a million shot, a gnat trying to get the attention of a giant. He would probably be laughed out of the building. But what was the alternative? To stand by and watch as his father's legacy was boarded up and sold to the highest bidder? To tell Lily they had to leave? He looked at his hands, at the deep lines and calluses that told the story of his life's work. He looked at the photo of his father, who had never backed down from a challenge. He looked over at the workbench where Lily's drawing of Wrenchman lay. "You can fix anything, Daddy." A fire he hadn't felt in years began to burn in his chest. He stood up, his back straighter now. He walked with purpose into the small office, wiping the grime from his hands onto a rag. He sat down in front of the old clunky desktop computer, its fan whirring noisily. He opened a new email, the blank white screen staring back at him. His fingers, more accustomed to the cold, hard feel of steel, hovered over the plastic keys. Then, with a deep breath that steadied his resolve, he began to type. 2. The office of Mr. Jonathan Sterling, CEO, Sterling Automotive. From David Miller, owner, Legacy Auto. Subject, a proposal regarding your unfixable cars. The drive to the city center was a journey between worlds. It began with the familiar, comforting rumble of David's 20-year-old pickup truck, a sound as familiar as his own heartbeat. The engine, which he'd rebuilt himself twice, hummed a tune of reliable imperfection. He passed rows of modest houses, neighborhood parks, and the small businesses that formed the fabric of his community. But as the miles rolled on, the landscape began to transform. The two-lane roads bled into four-lane highways. The humble brick buildings gave way to towering structures of gleaming steel and glass that clawed at the sky. David's truck, with its faded paint and a small dent in the fender from a rogue shopping cart, felt increasingly out of place. It was an analog machine in a digital city. He was surrounded by a river of silent electric vehicles and luxury imports that cost more than his garage was worth. He gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He had worn his best clothes, a clean pair of jeans, his least-stained work boots, and a collared shirt that felt stiff and unfamiliar around his neck. He felt like a child playing dress-up. Then he saw it. Sterling Tower. It wasn't just a building. It was a statement. A sheer cliff of smoked glass and obsidian steel that seemed to absorb the very sunlight around it, leaving the neighboring skyscrapers looking dull and ordinary. It was less a piece of architecture and more a monument to power and wealth. Pulling into the visitor's lane, he was met by a valet in a sharp gray uniform who looked at his truck with an expression of barely concealed horror, as if a farm animal had just wandered into a sterile operating room. "I have a meeting with Mr. Sterling," David said, his voice sounding small in the cavernous underground entrance. The valet's eyebrow twitched, a minuscule movement that conveyed immense doubt. But he checked his tablet, and his expression shifted to one of grudging surprise. "Mr. Miller, of course, you can leave the vehicle here." Stepping out of his truck, David felt the chill of the polished concrete floor seep through the soles of his boots. He walked towards the lobby doors, each step echoing in the sepulchral silence. The lobby itself was breathtaking and terrifying in equal measure. The floors were vast, unbroken sheets of white marble. The air was cool and smelled of nothing at all. There was no clutter, no life, just a single, imposing security desk carved from black granite, behind which sat a man who looked like he was carved from the same material. After confirming his identity, David was directed to the elevators. The ride up was a silent, stomach-lurching ascent. There were no buttons to press, just a soft chime as the elevator passed each floor. Through the glass wall, the city shrank below him, the cars and people becoming insignificant specks. He felt like he was ascending to another plane of existence, leaving the real world far behind. The elevator opened directly into a reception area on the penthouse floor. A woman with a headset and a serene, detached smile sat behind a minimalist white desk. "Mr. Miller? Mr. Sterling will be with you in a moment. Please, have a seat." The waiting area was a collection of stark leather chairs and a low glass table holding a single, artfully arranged orchid. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic clicking of the receptionist's keyboard. David sat on the edge of a chair that was likely worth more than his entire tool collection. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see the entirety of his world, the sprawl of the suburbs, the industrial parks, and somewhere in that haze, his tiny garage. From up here, it was all just part of a map, a territory to be owned. After 10 minutes that felt like an hour, the receptionist looked up. "Mr. Sterling will see you now." She gestured toward a set of massive double doors made of dark, imposing wood. They swung open silently as David approached, revealing the office beyond. It was an empire in a room. The space was immense, dominated by a panoramic view of the city on three sides. The fourth wall was lined with shelves holding meticulously arranged scale models of Sterling cars, each one a miniature monument to success. In the center of it all was a desk. It was less a piece of furniture and more a landmass, a vast chasm of polished mahogany that served to separate the man behind it from the rest of the world. And behind that desk sat Jonathan Sterling. He didn't look up when David entered. He was engrossed in a tablet, his finger flicking across the screen with sharp, decisive movements. He was a man in his 50s, with perfectly styled silver hair and a face that looked like it had been chiseled from expensive stone. He wore a suit so perfectly tailored it seemed to have been spun directly onto his body, the silence stretched, thick, and uncomfortable. It was a power play, and David knew it. He was being made to wait, to understand his insignificance. Finally, Without raising his eyes from the tablet, Sterling spoke. His voice was calm, crisp, and utterly devoid of warmth. Mr. Miller, I have your email. An interesting piece of fiction. Legacy Auto. I've never heard of it. David cleared his throat, his own voice sounding rough and alien in the pristine silence. We've been in business for 40 years, sir. My father started it. I know cars, and I know your cars have particular needs. At this, Sterling finally looked up. His eyes were a pale, piercing blue, and they scanned David from head to toe in a single, dismissive glance. The inspection lingered for a moment on David's work boots. A flicker of something amusement, contempt crossed Sterling's face before being suppressed. Particular needs, Sterling repeated, tasting the words. That's a polite way of putting it. My engineers, Mr. Miller, are graduates from the finest technical universities in the world. We spend over $200 million a year on research and development. We utilize proprietary diagnostic systems that are light years ahead of the industry standard. And you, from a garage I can only assume still uses paper invoices, believe you can solve problems my team cannot? Sometimes the computers can't see the whole picture, David said, his confidence growing slightly as he stood on the familiar ground of his craft. Sometimes you have to listen to the machine. Feel it. My father taught me. Your father, Sterling interrupted, the words sharp as glass, is irrelevant. This is not about sentiment or folksy wisdom, Mr. Miller. This is about complex, high-performance engineering. He leaned forward slightly, a predatory gleam in his eye. Let me be blunt. What could you possibly offer that my multi-million-dollar R&D department can't? A different perspective, David said firmly. I don't just see a collection of parts. I see a system, and I'm not afraid to get my hands dirty. Sterling leaned back in his chair, and a slow, cold smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a predator that had decided to play with its food. Grease under the fingernails. How rustic. He tapped a few commands into a screen on his desk. You have audacity, I'll grant you that. It's been a while since I've been so entertained. He stood up, his tall, lean frame exuding an aura of absolute command. He walked around the massive desk and beckoned David toward the window. Come here. Now. David followed, standing a respectful distance behind him as they looked out over the city. Sterling pointed, his finger aimed at a location far in the distance, a sprawling industrial lot on the outskirts of the Sterling manufacturing campus. Do you see that, Mr. Miller, that fenced-in lot? David squinted. In the distance, he could see rows of gleaming shapes, catching the afternoon sun like scattered jewels. That, Sterling said, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain, is what my people call the graveyard. It's a blemish on my reputation. A collection of our finest automobiles that have been declared, by the very geniuses I was telling you about, as unfixable. Phantom electrical issues, unsolvable engine knocking, transmission failures that defy all logic. 47 vehicles in total. He turned to face David, his blue eyes locking onto him. The combined value of those cars, Mr. Miller, is $34 million. It is a $34 million monument to my company's occasional and very private fallibility. It is an expensive, embarrassing problem. He paused, letting the weight of the numbers sink in. You want to prove yourself? You want to show me what your legacy is worth? He smirked. Fine. Here is my offer. You fix them, all of them. All 47. You make them run as they were designed to run, perfectly. David's mind raced. 47 cars. It was an insane, impossible number. And what's the timeline? David asked, his throat suddenly dry. Sterling's smirk widened. The bank is foreclosing on your property, are they not? Public records are so illuminating. Let's match their timeline. You have 30 days. 30 days. The words hit him like a physical blow. If you succeed, Sterling continued, savoring every word, if a single mechanic from a no-name garage can fix what my entire division of experts cannot, then you will have your exclusive service contract. I will personally announce our partnership. But if you fail, if even one car remains broken at the end of 30 days, I will not only take possession of those vehicles, but I will see to it that the name Legacy Auto is never spoken again in this city. You will close your doors and you will disappear. Am I clear? It was a cruel, impossible ultimatum, designed to crush him. He was being set up to fail spectacularly, to serve as an amusing little story for Sterling to tell at his country club. David's mind flashed with an image of the foreclosure notice, of Lily's trusting face, of his father's proud smile in the old photograph. He had come here with nothing to lose. That was no longer true. Now, he had everything to lose. He met Sterling's icy gaze. All the fear, all the intimidation, all the shame he had felt fell away, replaced by a cold, hard core of defiance. "I'll do it." For the first time, Jonathan Sterling's composure broke. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. It wasn't a sound of joy, but of pure, unadulterated disbelief. He shook his head, still chuckling, as he walked back to his desk. "Get him the access paperwork," he said to the air, dismissing David as if he were no longer there. "This should be fun to watch." David didn't say another word. He turned and walked out of the office, the massive wooden doors closing silently behind him. He rode the elevator down in a daze, the city rising up to meet him. He walked through the cold lobby, past the security desk, and out into the garage, where his old truck looked like a relic from another century. He got in, started the engine, and just sat there for a long moment. The familiar rumble, a comforting presence. The weight of his promise pressed down on him, heavier than any engine block, more complex than any wiring harness. 30 days, 47 cars, $34 million. He had just gambled his entire legacy on a bet he was never meant to win. The next morning, David drove to the address provided on the paperwork, a location on the far edge of the sprawling Sterling Automotive campus. The sterile perfection of the main facilities gave way to a more industrial landscape of warehouses and loading docks. He followed a long access road that ran parallel to a high, chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. It felt less like the backlot of a car company and more like a low-security prison. He was met at the gate by a man named Henderson, a lot manager with a permanent scowl and the weary, cynical eyes of someone who had seen too much corporate failure. Henderson's uniform was rumpled, and he held a clipboard like a shield. "You're the guy," Henderson said. It wasn't a question. "The one with the death wish." "Something like that," David replied, stepping out of his truck. Henderson grunted and unlocked the heavy gate, which swung open with a groan of protesting metal. "Right this way. Welcome to the graveyard." The name was apt. As David walked past the gate, the sheer scale of the challenge hit him with the force of a physical impact. This was no mere collection of broken-down cars. It was a silent, sprawling field of automotive ghosts. Rows upon rows of Sterling's finest models, Sentinel sedans, Peregrine sports coupes, and massive Apex SUVs sat in silent, orderly lines under the pale morning sun. Their paint, even under a fine layer of dust, gleamed with promise. Their designs were sleek and aggressive. They were monuments of ambition, each one now a testament to failure. It was eerie. There was no sound but the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the whisper of the wind whipping across the open lot. It felt disrespectful to speak too loudly. "So what's the story here?" David asked, his voice low. "Same story 47 times, Henderson said, waving his clipboard dismissively at the nearest row. "They roll off the assembly line perfect. They pass every diagnostic. Then, a few weeks or months later, they come back on a flatbed. The customer is furious. Our techs are baffled. They throw parts at it. They reflash the software. They consult with the engineers in the tower. Nothing. Eventually, Mr. Sterling gets tired of the expense and the embarrassment, and they end up here." The end. David walked toward the closest car, a stunning Sterling Sentinel in a deep metallic blue. It looked flawless. Not a scratch on the body. The tires still looked new. It was a machine in its absolute prime, yet it sat here, dead. He placed a hand on the cool metal of the hood, almost expecting to feel a tremor of life. There was nothing. It was just a beautiful hollow shell. "This one?" he asked. "Phantom electrical drain." Henderson recited from memory, his voice flat and bored. "Leave a battery in it overnight. It's dead by morning." They replaced the alternator, the starter, the entire wiring harness, twice, ripped the whole car apart and put it back together. "Still drains. It's cursed." "Oh." David peered through the window at the pristine leather interior. He could almost feel the frustration of the engineers who had worked on it. They had followed the book, run the tests, and trusted their computers. But the car had a secret it refused to share. He moved to the next car, a silver sports coupe. Transmission control module failure, Henderson droned on. Second and third gear refuse to engage. We've put 3 brand new modules in it. Each one works for about 10 minutes, then shorts out. The engineers think there's a power surge coming from somewhere, but they can't find it. On and on it went. Each car had its own file, its own history of failed attempts and baffled experts. A fuel injection system that drowned the engine, a suspension that randomly locked up, a navigation system that would crash the car's entire onboard computer. These weren't simple mechanical failures. They were complex, overlapping symphonies of dysfunction. David walked the rows, a surgeon surveying a ward of terminally ill patients. But where Henderson saw only defeat, David saw puzzles, intricate, frustrating, and utterly fascinating puzzles. After an hour, David had seen enough. The monumental, soul-crushing scale of the task was clear. He couldn't do this alone. There was only one person he knew who possessed the patience and the specific, peculiar genius required for a job this insane. Sal's Auto Parts was the antithesis of Sterling Tower. The small, brick-fronted shop was overflowing with parts from every era of automotive history. Hubcaps from the 1972nd hung on the walls like trophies. Rebuilt carburetors sat on shelves next to modern fuel injectors. The air was thick with the smell of old cardboard, rubber, and Sal's ever-present cigar. David found Sal himself behind the counter, a short, stocky man in his 60s with a formidable mustache and a permanent scowl etched onto his face. He was hunched over a complex alternator, a soldering iron in one hand and a magnifying glass in the other. Sal was his father's oldest friend and former partner. He was a master of automotive electronics, a wizard with wiring who could diagnose a short circuit by smell. He was also grumpy, stubborn, and deeply skeptical of the modern world. "Look what the cat dragged in," Sal grumbled without looking up. "Finally decide to come visit an old man. Or do you need a part you can't get anywhere else?" "I need your help, Sal," David said, getting straight to the point. Sal set down his soldering iron and finally looked at David over the top of his spectacles. He took a long puff from his cigar. "Help? You're the best wrench in this city, kid. What could you possibly need my help with?" David took a deep breath. "I made a deal with Jonathan Sterling." Sal's bushy eyebrows shot up. The cigar nearly fell out of his mouth. "You did what? You went to that pinstriped shark? Are you out of your mind?" David quickly explained the whole situation. The foreclosure notice, the desperate meeting, the impossible challenge. He told him about the graveyard, the 47 cars, and the 30-day deadline. As David spoke, Sal's expression shifted from shock to disbelief, and finally to a deep, profound anger. When David finished, Sal was silent for a full minute, staring at him. "You're a fool, David," he finally said, his voice low and serious. "A bigger fool than your father, and that's saying something. This isn't a deal. This is an execution. Sterling isn't giving you an opportunity. He's building a stage to watch you fail." "I know it's a long shot," David started. "Long shot?" Sal scoffed, slamming a hand down on the counter, making a stack of oil filters jump. "A long shot is betting on a horse that's never raced. This is betting on a horse with 3 legs against a fighter jet. You're fighting a god, kid. Sterling will crush you for the sheer sport of it, and he won't think twice." "I don't have a choice, Sal. I'm going to lose the garage anyway. This is the only chance I have, the only one." Sal shook his head, his expression softening slightly with pity. "There are other ways. You could downsize, move to a cheaper location. You're a good mechanic. You'd survive." "Survive?" David's voice rose with passion. "I don't want to just survive. That place is my father's legacy. It's my legacy. It's the only thing I have to give to Lily. I'm not going to let some banker lock the doors and auction off my father's tools. I can't." Sal took off his glasses and rubbed his tired eyes. He looked around his own cluttered shop, a fortress he had built against a changing world. He understood legacy. He had worked side by side with Frank Miller for 20 years. He remembered David as a little boy, running around the garage with a toy wrench, trying to help them. "Your father," Sal said quietly, "was the most brilliant, stubborn man I ever knew. He could have gone to work for Sterling years ago. They offered him a blank check. You know why he turned it down?" David shook his head. "He said their cars had no soul. He said they were built by accountants, not craftsmen. He said they cared more about the polish on the hood ornament than the integrity of the engine block. It made him furious. He knew they were cutting corners, even back then. Sal sighed, a plume of smoke escaping his lips. This fight you're picking? It's the same one he was fighting his whole life. David didn't argue. He didn't try to counter Sal's logic. He just stood there, his desperation and his determination laid bare. He appealed to the one thing he knew Sal valued more than anything. You made a promise to him, Sal. You promised you'd look out for me. The words hung in the air between them, heavier than any car part. Sal stared at David, his gaze intense. He saw the spitting image of his old friend standing before him, the same fire in the eyes, the same impossible stubbornness. He saw the same fight. Sal let out a long, slow sigh of resignation, the sound of a man who knew he was about to make a terrible decision. He looked at the alternator on his workbench, then back at David. He slowly stubbed out his cigar in a clean piston head he used as an ashtray. He walked to the back of the shop and returned a moment later, wiping his hands on a rag. He then reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy, metal toolbox. It was old, covered in scratches and stickers from a bygone era. It was his old mobile kit, the one he hadn't used in years. He heaved it onto the counter with a loud thud. Your father was a stubborn fool, Sal grumbled, a hint of grudging affection in his voice. And you're his son, all right. He looked David square in the eye. Fine. Let's go see these dead cars. But when Sterling is personally throwing your tools into the street, don't say I didn't warn you. A wave of relief so powerful it made David feel lightheaded washed over him. He broke into a wide grin. Thank you, Sal. Don't thank me yet, Sal grumbled, grabbing his jacket. We haven't fixed anything. Let's get the first one towed to your place. The ugliest, most cursed one you can find. We'll start there. As they walked out of the shop and into the daylight, David felt a flicker of hope for the first time since he'd left Sterling Tower. It was a foolish hope, a tiny flame in a hurricane, but it was there. He wasn't alone anymore. The battle for Legacy Auto had officially begun. The first car arrived at Legacy Auto late that afternoon, delivered on a flatbed tow truck dispatched by Sterling Automotive. The driver, wearing a crisp uniform, handled the vehicle with a practiced, almost bored indifference, as if he were delivering a piece of defective furniture. But to David and Sal, the deep metallic blue Sterling Sentinel sedan that rolled into their bay wasn't just a car. It was the first battle of a long war. It was the one Henderson had called cursed. The car with the phantom electrical drain that had baffled a team of high-paid experts. As it sat under the fluorescent lights of the garage, it looked immaculate, a perfect specimen of modern engineering. There was no visible sign of trauma, no hint of the ghost in its machine. Lily watched from her designated corner, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and concern. Is it sick, Daddy? It is, sweetie, David said, circling the car slowly, his eyes scanning every line. But we're the doctors. We're going to make it better. Sal was less optimistic. He stood with his arms crossed, a cigar clamped in his jaw, his expression a mask of pure skepticism. He had a thick, heavy service binder, sent over from Sterling, open on a workbench. It was filled with hundreds of pages of technical schematics and service notes. According to this masterpiece of fiction, Sal grumbled, tapping a page with a greasy finger, their engineers have already replaced every major component of the charging and starting system. The alternator is new, the battery is new, the starter is new. They even replaced the main ECU, the car's brain. It's like declaring a patient dead after you've already given them a full-body transplant. For the next 2 days, they followed the book. It was a frustrating, soul-crushing exercise in futility. They hooked up Sterling's proprietary diagnostic tools, complex laptops that ran software far more advanced than anything David owned. They ran the tests, followed the troubleshooting trees, and dutifully checked every connection and ground point listed in the manual. They worked in a tense silence. The only sounds, the clicking of relays, the beeping of multimeters, and Sal's increasingly creative cursing. By the end of the second day, they were exactly where Sterling's engineers had been. Nowhere. They had a perfectly assembled car that, according to every computer and every schematic, should have been in perfect working order. Yet, when they hooked up a fresh battery, they could literally watch the voltage drain away on the multimeter, a slow, silent bleed of energy into nothingness. That's it. I'm done, Sal declared, throwing a wrench onto the workbench with a loud clatter. Lily jumped at the sound. It's a lemon. A $34 million lemon orchard. We're chasing a ghost, kid. This car wasn't built. It was conjured by demons. I need a coffee. He stormed off toward the small office, leaving David alone with the silent, defiant machine. David leaned against the fender, the cold metal, a stark contrast to his own frustration. He was tired. The hope he had felt when Sal agreed to help was beginning to curdle into the familiar taste of despair. He looked at the diagnostic laptop, its screen filled with green checkmarks and System OK messages. It was lying. "You're listening to the wrong story," a voice in his head whispered. It sounded like his father. His father had always said that computers were tools, not mechanics. They could tell you what they were programmed to see, but they couldn't tell you about the things they weren't. They had no intuition, no instinct. They couldn't feel when something was wrong. David pushed himself off the fender. "All right," he said to the empty garage. "No more computers." He walked over to his main toolbox and opened a drawer filled with tools that most modern mechanics would consider relics. He pulled out a simple mechanic's stethoscope, the kind doctors use, but with a long metal probe at the end. Sal reappeared in the doorway, holding a steaming mug, his scowl firmly in place. "What are you doing with that museum piece?" Sal asked. "I'm going to listen," David said simply. He placed the tip of the probe against the main fuse box. He closed his eyes, shutting out the world, focusing only on the faint sounds traveling up the probe to his ears. He listened to the quiet hum of the relays, the low-frequency buzz of the car's standby systems. He was listening for an anomaly, a sound that didn't belong. For an hour, he moved methodically through the engine bay, then into the car's interior, pressing the stethoscope against every component he could reach. Sal watched, a cynical observer to what he considered an act of pointless automotive voodoo. But as time wore on, his expression shifted from mockery to grudging curiosity. He saw the intensity of David's concentration, the way he was interacting with the car not as an object, but as a living system. Finally, David froze. He was under the dashboard on the passenger side, his body contorted in a space no human was meant to fit. The stethoscope was pressed against a thick bundle of wires, deep behind the glove box. "What is it?" Sal asked, his voice low. "Shh," David whispered. He motioned for Sal to come closer. "Listen." He handed the earpieces to Sal. Sal put them on, his face a mask of doubt. He listened, and then his bushy eyebrows shot up. It was an incredibly faint sound, almost imperceptible. A tiny, high-frequency hiss. It was the sound of electricity arcing, of energy escaping. "It's a short," Sal breathed, his voice filled with disbelief. "A micro short. The drain is so small, so consistent, the computer just reads it as part of the car's normal standby power. It wouldn't register as a fault." "Exactly," David said, his voice tight with excitement as he pulled himself out from under the dash. "Now, where is it coming from?" They consulted the official Sterling schematics on Sal's binder. They looked at the diagram for the wiring harness behind the glove box. According to the blueprint, the space where David had heard the sound was supposed to be empty. It was just a pass-through for a major wiring loom. There were no junctions, no connectors, nothing that could possibly short out. "The blueprint is wrong," David said. "That's impossible," Sal countered. "This is Sterling. Their specs are perfect." "Their specs are what the designers intended," David shot back. "I'm telling you what's actually in the car. It's an assembly line error." Fueled by a new surge of adrenaline, they began the delicate process of deconstructing the dashboard. It was slow, painstaking work. They removed panels and components with surgical precision, laying them out on a clean blanket. After another hour of careful work, they exposed the thick wiring harness. And there it was. It was almost invisible to the naked eye. During the car's assembly, a single metal retaining clip, designed to hold the harness against the chassis, had been installed a fraction of an inch off its mark. Over time, the vibrations of the engine had caused the sharp edge of the clip to rub through the insulation of a single, non-critical wire, a wire leading to the vanity mirror light in the passenger side sun visor. The wire was shorting directly to the car's frame. It wasn't a big enough drain to blow a fuse, but it was a constant, tiny leak of power. It was a wound so small that the car's advanced nervous system didn't even know it was bleeding. It was a simple, stupid, human error that no computer could ever have been programmed to find. Sal stared at the exposed wire, his mouth hanging slightly open. He looked from the wire to David, and for the first time, The perpetual scowl was gone, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated respect. "I'll be damned," he whispered. The ghost in the machine was a half-cent metal clip. The repair itself was anticlimactic. David carefully cut the damaged section of wire, spliced in a new piece, and sealed it with heat-shrink tubing. Then, he wrapped the entire section of the harness in protective casing and gently bent the offending clip out of the way. It took less than 10 minutes. The next 2 hours were spent meticulously putting the dashboard back together. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. The car was whole again. The tools were put away. Sal stood by the workbench, arms crossed, but this time his posture was one of anticipation, not doubt. Lily had crept closer, her big eyes fixed on her father. David slid into the plush leather of the driver's seat. The cockpit, with its dark wood trim and polished chrome, felt like a shrine to a technology that had failed. He took a deep, steadying breath. He exchanged a nervous glance with Sal, who gave him a single, sharp nod. He put the key in the ignition and turned it. The dashboard lit up. The gauges swept across their dials in a silent, graceful dance. The engine turned over once, twice, and then it caught. It didn't just start. It erupted. The V8 engine roared to life, not with a sputter or a cough, but with a deep, resonant, and perfectly smooth growl. It was the sound of a thoroughbred, finally allowed to run. The sound of hope. A wide, triumphant grin split David's face. In the reflection of the rearview mirror, he could see Sal shaking his head in disbelief, a genuine smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Lily was jumping up and down, clapping her hands. It was more than just one car. It was proof. Proof that his method worked. Proof that intuition, experience, and the willingness to listen were more powerful than any diagnostic machine. He could do this. It wasn't impossible. He revved the engine once more, the powerful sound echoing through the small garage, chasing away the shadows of doubt. He turned to Sal, his voice filled with a confidence he hadn't felt in years. "One down," he said. Later that night, after Sal and Lily had gone home, David found an old, dusty whiteboard in a storage closet. He cleaned it off and mounted it on the wall, right in the center of the main workspace. He picked up a thick black marker. In big, bold, triumphant letters, he wrote, "Car number 1, done." He stared at the words, a feeling of fierce pride swelling in his chest. 46 to go, bring them on. The first victory lit a fire in Legacy Auto. The garage, once quiet and heavy with the weight of impending failure, was now filled with a new kind of energy. It was the thrum of purpose, the rhythm of a team hitting its stride. The delivery of the second car from the graveyard felt less like an incoming patient and more like the next challenger stepping into the ring. A new routine quickly took shape, a dance of choreographed competence between David and Sal. The tow truck would arrive, depositing another gleaming, silent Sterling in the bay. Sal, now a firm believer, would be the first to attack. With the service binder and a formidable array of his own custom-built diagnostic tools, he became the electronics specialist. He was a wiring whisperer, hunting for the kind of micro-faults and phantom signals their first success had taught them to look for. He bypassed the official Sterling software, treating the car's complex computer systems not as gospel, but as unreliable witnesses that needed to be cross-examined. While Sal mapped the car's nervous system, David would focus on its heart and bones. He was the master of mechanics, his hands able to read the story told by worn metal and subtle vibrations. He would listen to the engine, even when it wouldn't turn over, using his stethoscope to detect the telltale silence of a seized bearing or the faint click of a stuck valve. He trusted his senses over sensors, his experience over error codes. Lily, caught up in the excitement, appointed herself chief morale officer. She took her role very seriously. She made sure the coffee pot was always full, a task she performed with the gravity of a chemist mixing a vital formula. She would wipe down tools with a rag, presenting them to her father and Sal with a proud flourish. When the days grew long and frustration began to simmer, she would appear with cups of lemonade or a plate of cookies, her bright smile a more effective remedy than any break could be. Her presence transformed the greasy garage from a mere workshop into a home, a headquarters for their impossible mission. The whiteboard became their sacred text. Car number 2, done. A luxury SUV with a flooded engine, caused by a misaligned fuel injector that the onboard computer had failed to register. Car number 3. Done. A sports coupe with a seized transmission, traced back to a faulty temperature sensor that was feeding incorrect data to the cooling system, causing the transmission fluid to overheat and break down. Car number 4. Done. A sedan with a suspension that would randomly lock up. Sal discovered a software glitch that misinterpreted data from the wheel speed sensors after hitting a pothole, triggering a catastrophic failure safety mode. They worked with a relentless driving pace. Days bled into nights. The scent of coffee and grease was constant. Empty pizza boxes became a permanent feature of the office decor. They celebrated each small victory: the first cough of a reviving engine, a dashboard lighting up correctly, a diagnostic test finally returning a true positive, with a shared look of triumph or a quiet fist bump. They were no longer just a mechanic and his father's old friend. They were a team, united against a common enemy of flawed perfection. Then they hit the wall. The wall was painted a fiery, metallic red and shaped like a sterling falcon, one of only a few hundred ever made. It was a low-slung, aggressive sports car, and its problem was as exotic as its design. The transmission was stuck in limp mode, a state that prevented it from shifting beyond second gear. Sal spent 3 days chasing the electronic phantom. He tested every wire, every sensor, every relay. Everything checked out. The problem wasn't in the car's nerves. The problem was in its brain, a proprietary sealed transmission control module, TCM, that was, according to the file, non-serviceable. Sterling's own technicians had already tried replacing it twice with new units, both of which had failed within minutes. The company had since ceased production of the part. There were no more. "We're done," Sal said, slumping into a chair, the binder open on his lap. "There are no more modules. It's a paperweight. A very fast, very expensive paperweight." For the first time since they started, David felt a cold stab of real doubt. This wasn't a puzzle to be solved with intuition. This was a dead end, a locked door with no key. He could feel the precious hours of their 30-day deadline ticking away. But then he looked at the whiteboard, at the growing list of their successes. He looked at the sealed black box of the TCM sitting on the workbench. Non-serviceable. It was a declaration, a challenge. A line drawn in the sand by an engineer in a lab coat. "Nothing is unfixable," David said, his voice quiet but firm. Sal looked at him like he was crazy. "Kid, that thing is a black box. It's filled with microscopic circuits and proprietary code. It's sealed for a reason. You try to open it, you'll destroy it." "It's already destroyed," David countered. "What have we got to lose?" For the next 2 days, David embarked on his most audacious task yet. He began by carefully, painstakingly cutting open the sealed plastic casing of the TCM, using a heated wire to get a clean edge. Inside was a dense, complex circuit board, a miniature city of chips, capacitors, and resistors. He spent hours hunched over it with a magnifying glass and a digital camera, taking high-resolution photos and mapping every single circuit path by hand onto a large sheet of paper. He was reverse engineering it. Sal, his skepticism warring with his professional curiosity, found himself drawn in, helping David identify components and trace connections. They discovered the point of failure. A minuscule power regulator chip, no bigger than a grain of rice, had burned out. It was a common, off-the-shelf component, but it was positioned so close to another chip that it was prone to overheating under heavy load, a catastrophic design flaw in a high-performance sports car. The problem was, replacing it was impossible. The chip was soldered onto the board with microscopic precision. One wrong move, and the entire board would be fried. David didn't sleep. Fueled by coffee and sheer stubbornness, he converted his workbench into a makeshift electronics lab. He built a tiny, custom soldering tip from a copper wire and practiced on old, broken circuit boards from junked radios. He worked for hours, his hands steady, his focus absolute. Finally, the moment came. With Sal holding a magnifying glass and a bright light, David leaned over the TCM, the tiny soldering iron in his hand as steady as a surgeon's scalpel. He held his breath, touched the iron to the connection points, and in a move that took less than a second, the new chip was in place. The silence in the garage was absolute. Had he just destroyed their only chance? They reinstalled the module, connected the battery, and David slid into the driver's seat. He turned the key. The engine roared to life. He put the car in drive and pulled slowly out of the bay. He shifted into second. Then, holding his breath, he pushed the shifter into third. The transmission engaged smoothly, perfectly. He let out a whoop of pure joy that echoed down the quiet street. He had done it. He hadn't just fixed a part, he had resurrected it. Late one evening, halfway through the third week, a dark, unmarked sedan pulled up across the street from Legacy Auto. Jonathan Sterling sat in the passenger seat, his driver waiting silently behind the wheel. He wasn't wearing his usual power suit, but a simple, dark, cashmere sweater. He had come unannounced, driven by a nagging curiosity he couldn't shake. His head of engineering, Dr. Thorne, had been sending him daily updates. At first, they were dismissive. The first car was a fluke, Thorne had reported. A lucky guess. But the updates had grown more grudgingly respectful. Subject is employing unorthodox methods. Appears to be bypassing standard diagnostics. Success rate is unexpected. Sterling watched his multi-million-dollar cars, one after another, being towed into the shabby little garage, and then, a few days later, being driven out under their own power to a secure holding lot. It was impossible. He got out of the car and walked quietly to the edge of the property, staying in the shadows of a neighboring building. The main garage door was open, spilling warm yellow light onto the asphalt. The scene inside was not what he expected. He saw David, his face streaked with grease, leaning over the open hood of a Sterling Apex. His head was tilted, and he was talking. Not to anyone, but to the engine itself. A quiet, one-sided conversation. Sterling saw Sal hunched over a workbench covered in wires, a halo of smoke around his head. He saw the little girl, Lily, carefully organizing a set of wrenches on a magnetic tray, and he saw the whiteboard. Car number 17, done. 17. In just over 2 weeks. Sterling watched as David, without looking, reached his hand back. "Quarter-inch socket," he said. The little girl, Lily, immediately picked the correct socket from her tray and placed it in her father's hand. The exchange was seamless, practiced. It was a perfect display of teamwork, born not of corporate procedure, but of love and trust. A memory, distant and faded, surfaced in Sterling's mind. A memory of himself as a young man, working on his first car with his own father in a dusty garage, the shared joy of making a machine come to life. When was the last time he'd even held a wrench? When was the last time he'd felt that passion, that pure, unadulterated joy of creation? He had built an empire of cars, but had somehow lost the love for the car itself. He saw a level of dedication and raw, intuitive talent that he knew his sterile white coat labs could never replicate. His engineers were brilliant, but they were problem solvers. This man, David Miller, he was a healer. Sterling stood there for a long time, a silent observer in the darkness. Then, without a word, he turned and walked back to his car, a profound and unsettling feeling stirring within him. He had set this up as a joke, a public humiliation for an audacious nobody. But as he looked at the humble garage, glowing with purpose against the night, he had the sinking feeling that the joke was on him. He got back into the car, the plush leather feeling cold and foreign. "Sir?" his driver asked. Sterling didn't answer immediately. He just stared at the little garage. He had built his company on the idea of flawless, superior engineering. But what he had just witnessed was something else entirely. It was artistry. The file was delivered to Jonathan Sterling's penthouse office the next morning. It was thin, almost comically so, a single manila folder in a world of terabyte servers. It felt like an artifact from another era. The tab read, "Miller, Frank." He dismissed his assistant and sat alone in the vast, silent office. The city spread out below him like a blueprint. He opened it. The documents inside were crisp, preserved by the sterile, climate-controlled archives. There was a formal job offer, dated 20 years prior, for the position of master technician and diagnostic consultant. The salary offered was astronomical for the time, enough to make any mechanic abandon his independent shop without a second thought. Below it was Frank Miller's response. It wasn't a formal letter, but a handwritten note on Miller & Son auto letterhead. The handwriting was neat, precise, and forceful. Sterling read the note, then read it again. Frank Miller had not just declined the offer, he had eviscerated it. Mr. Sterling, the note began, I am a mechanic, not a magician. My job is to fix automobiles, not to cover up the design flaws of accountants. You are building cars with a fatal flaw woven into their very DNA. Your obsession with a seamless exterior and whisper-quiet ride has led you to sacrifice core mechanical integrity. You are insulating your engines and transmissions to a degree that is suffocating them, creating heat traps that will inevitably lead to premature component failure. Your cars have no soul because the men who build them are no longer allowed to be craftsmen. They are merely assemblers. I cannot, in good conscience, take your money to put bandages on wounds that you intend to inflict on every car you sell. Respectfully, Frank Miller. Sterling stared at the note, a cold feeling creeping up his spine. Heat traps. He remembered a series of internal engineering reports from a decade ago, reports he had dismissed as overly cautious. They had warned about potential long-term heat degradation in certain transmission components. The proposed solution, adding ventilation grills to the underbody, was vetoed by the design department as it would have disrupted the car's perfectly smooth aerodynamic profile. Aesthetics and the fuel efficiency numbers that came with it had won. The reports were quietly shelved. He picked up the phone. Get Dr. Thorne up here, now. Dr. Eris Thorne was the head of Sterling's R&D division. A man with 3 PhDs and an air of intellectual superiority that Sterling normally found reassuring. Today, it was irritating. Thorne entered the office, holding a tablet displaying the latest report on David Miller's progress. 23 cars, Jonathan, Thorne said, his voice a mixture of disbelief and professional indignation. He's fixed 23 of them. It's statistically impossible. My teams are analyzing his repair logs. The fixes are unorthodox. He's ignoring standard procedure entirely. On the last vehicle, he bypassed a faulty sensor by fabricating a mechanical linkage. It's practically medieval. But it works. Forget his methods, Sterling said, his voice sharp. He slid Frank Miller's handwritten note across the vast expanse of his desk. Read that. Thorne picked up the note, his brow furrowed. He read it, his expression shifting from curiosity to a defensive scowl. This is from 20 years ago. It's irrelevant. This man was a glorified grease monkey. Was he wrong? Sterling pressed, his voice dangerously quiet. His premise is simplistic, Thorne hedged, choosing his words carefully. He's not accounting for advances in synthetic lubricants, thermal management software, new composite materials. Was he wrong, Eris? Sterling repeated, his gaze unwavering. Look at the list of Miller's repairs. The Falcon's overheated TCM, the Sentinel's transmission fluid breakdown, the recurring sensor failures. Is there a pattern? Thorne fell silent. He knew there was. For years, they had been treating each failure as an isolated incident, a statistical anomaly. They had never considered that the ghost in the machine wasn't a random gremlin, but a direct, predictable consequence of their own design philosophy. A ghost they had created themselves. The data suggests a possible correlation between component failure and prolonged high-temperature operation in certain enclosed systems, Thorne admitted, his voice stiff with jargon. But it's within acceptable parameters. Acceptable to whom? Sterling shot back. The accountants? Or the customers stranded on the side of the road? Or the mechanic in the dirty little garage who is making my entire $200 million R&D department look like a pack of fools? Sterling snatched the note back. A fatal flaw woven into their very DNA. The words echoed in the silent, opulent office. He had seen David Miller not as a threat, but as an amusement. He was beginning to realize he was a judge, and the verdict was coming due. Back at Legacy Auto, the same truth was dawning, not through old files and corporate reports, but through grease and steel. David was deep in the engine bay of car number 24, a Sterling Apex SUV. The official report said the vehicle suffered from intermittent and catastrophic power loss. The previous mechanics had replaced the entire fuel system to no avail. But David had noticed the pattern. It was subtle, a breadcrumb trail left across nearly 24 vehicles. It was in the premature decay of rubber gaskets, the discoloration of plastic connectors near the engine block, the unusually high operating temperatures he'd noted on the cars he could get running. Sal, come look at this, he called out, his voice muffled. Sal ambled over, peering into the engine bay. David was pointing at the main engine wiring harness. To a casual observer, it looked fine, but David had seen it before. "Look at the insulation," David said. "It's brittle. See these hairline cracks?" He gently bent a section of the thick cable, and the outer black casing flaked away, revealing the colored wires within. "This harness is rated for high temperatures, but it feels like it's been slow cooked for a year." "Heat degradation," Sal said, the pieces clicking into place in his own mind. "It's the same thing we saw on that Falcon's TCM. The components are being baked." David straightened up, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. "It's not just one component, Sal. It's the whole design. Look," he gestured around the engine bay. "They've packed everything so tightly. It's clean, it's efficient, it looks great on a showroom floor, but there's no airflow. They've wrapped the engine in sound-dampening insulation to make it quiet, but they've created an oven. The heat has nowhere to go. It just soaks into every wire, every sensor, every plastic part. They're not failing because they're defective. They're failing because they're being slowly cooked to death." It was a profound, horrifying realization. This wasn't a series of unrelated misfortunes. It was a single, systemic, catastrophic design flaw that permeated the entire Sterling lineup. A flaw born of hubris. A flaw that prioritized the feeling of luxury over the reality of sound engineering. His mission suddenly felt different. He wasn't just fixing cars to save his garage anymore. He was uncovering a truth, a deliberate deception hidden under $1 billion worth of polished chrome and marketing. This was why Sterling's experts could never find the problem. They were looking for broken parts, assuming the whole was sound. They never thought to question the fundamental design itself. They couldn't see the forest for the trees. That evening, long after Sal and Lily had gone home, David was cleaning out his father's old roll-top desk, looking for an old parts receipt. In a dusty folder tucked away in the back of a deep drawer, he found a small stack of papers. They were carbon copies of letters his father had sent, correspondence from 20 years ago. One of them was addressed to the office of the CEO, Sterling Automotive. He held the thin, yellowed paper under the desk lamp. It was a copy of the very same letter Jonathan Sterling had read that morning. "You are building cars with a fatal flaw." David sank into the old office chair, the letter trembling in his hand. His father had known. He had seen it all those years ago, had tried to warn them, and had been dismissed as a grease monkey. This wasn't just David's fight anymore. It had been his father's first. The weight of that legacy settled on his shoulders, no longer a burden, but a mantle. He was no longer just defending his garage. He was vindicating his father's wisdom. He looked at the whiteboard, at the tally of fixed cars. Each check mark wasn't just a win for him. It was a testament to the truth his father had tried to tell. The ghost in the machine had a name, and it was Sterling's own pride. David now knew he couldn't just fix the cars. He had to make the man who built them understand why they had broken in the first place. The fourth week began with a relentless, punishing rhythm. The initial thrill of discovery had faded, replaced by the grim reality of the marathon. The garage was no longer a headquarters of triumphant rebellion. It was a field hospital in a war of attrition. The air, once electric with hope, was now heavy, with the smell of stale coffee, sleepless nights, and the metallic tang of fatigue. They had crossed the halfway mark on the whiteboard. Car number 31, done. But the remaining vehicles seemed to be the most difficult, the ones with layers of overlapping, heat-induced maladies. The work was no longer about clever diagnoses. It was a brutal slog of manual labor, of replacing entire wiring harnesses, of fabricating heat shields Sterling's engineers had never dreamed of. David felt the exhaustion deep in his bones. He was running on fumes, his body aching with a weariness that sleep no longer seemed to touch. His hands, normally so steady, had begun to develop a faint tremor. One afternoon, while working on a complex fuel injector assembly, his tired mind made a simple miscalculation. He over-tightened a brass fitting, and with a sickeningly soft snap, the thread stripped. It was a small mistake, but a critical one. The part was unique to that model, and getting a replacement from Sterling's Central Parts Depot would take 24 hours. A full day. Lost? Idiot? He snarled, throwing the ruined fitting against the wall. It bounced off the concrete with a pathetic clink. He slumped against the workbench, burying his face in his hands, the frustration and exhaustion washing over him in a bitter wave. Sal, who was wrestling with a stubborn ECU, looked over, his own face etched with fatigue. His usual grumpiness had been worn down to a quiet, frayed patience. "Easy, kid," he said, his voice raspy. "It happens. We'll work on the next one while we wait for the part." "We don't have time for it happens, Sal," David snapped, his voice raw. "We have 6 days left and 16 cars to go. We're not going to make it." The pressure, which had been a motivating force, was now a suffocating weight. Every tick of the clock sounded like a hammer blow. The sheer, overwhelming volume of the remaining work stretched out before him like an impossible mountain range. For the first time, he felt the cold, hard certainty of failure. That evening, the breaking point arrived. It didn't come in the form of a broken car part, but in the form of his daughter. Lily had been a constant, cheerful presence, a small, bright sun in their greasy universe. But when he picked her up from her after-school program, she was quiet. Her usual bubbly energy was gone, replaced by a listless apathy. She felt warm to the touch. By the time they got back to the garage, her cheeks were flushed with fever. David's world narrowed instantly. The cars, the deadline, Sterling it all vanished. All that mattered was the small, hot hand in his. He took her temperature, 102 degrees. He set her up on the small cot in his office, covering her with a blanket. He sat beside her, placing a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. She looked up at him, her eyes glassy and tired. "Is Wrenchman taking a break, Daddy?" she whispered, her voice weak. The simple question shattered him. He was Wrenchman. He was supposed to fix everything, but he couldn't fix this. And while he was here, chasing this insane dream, his daughter was getting sick. The guilt was a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. What was he doing? He was sacrificing his daughter's well-being for a pile of metal and a foolish sense of pride. His father's legacy wasn't worth this. Nothing was. Sal found him sitting there an hour later, staring blankly at the wall, the cool cloth in his hands. "How is she?" Sal asked quietly. "She has a fever," David said, his voice flat and empty. "I gave her some medicine. I should take her home." "We can take a few hours off," Sal said, trying to be reassuring. "I can stay here, keep working on the Apex." "No," David said, his voice cracking. He finally looked at Sal. His eyes filled with a despair so profound it startled the older man. "It's over, Sal. I'm done. I can't do this. I'm out here killing myself for what? For him? For that man in his tower to have a good laugh?" He was right. "I'm a fool. My daughter is sick, and I'm here playing superhero in a garage. I'm tapping out." He stood up, his movement stiff. "Call them in the morning. Tell them to come get their cars. I quit." Sal didn't argue. He didn't try to talk him out of it. He just stood there, his weathered face impassive. He looked at Lily, sleeping fitfully on the cot, and then at David, a man hollowed out by exhaustion and fear. "All right, kid," Sal said softly. "You do what you have to do. Take her home, get some rest." David nodded numbly, gently scooping the sleeping Lily into his arms. She felt so small, so fragile. As he carried her out of the garage, he didn't even glance at the half-fixed cars or the triumphant whiteboard. They were monuments to his own folly. It was all over. David spent a restless night by Lily's side. He barely slept, waking at every small cough or whimper. He felt like a complete failure, not just as a mechanic, but as a father. He had been so obsessed with honoring his own father's memory that he was failing in his most important duty to his daughter. The morning brought a small mercy. Lily's fever had broken. She was still weak, but the glassy look was gone from her eyes. He made her toast and sat with her on the couch, feeling the quiet relief of a crisis averted. He had made his decision. He would call Sterling's office as soon as they opened and forfeit the challenge. He would face the foreclosure, sell his tools, and find a job at some quick lube chain. They would survive. It would be humiliating, but Lily would be safe. Around mid-morning, the phone rang. It was Sal. "Don't hang up," Sal said, his voice gruff. "Just listen. I'm at the garage. The part for the fuel injector came. I installed it. Car number 32 is done." "Sal, I told you." "I know what you told me," Sal interrupted. "And you were right to say it. You were a father first. That's what you're supposed to do." There was a pause. David could hear the faint sound of an air wrench in the background. "But I'm not a father. I'm a grumpy old mechanic who made a promise to his best friend. And your father never ever quit. Not because he was stubborn, well, not just because he was stubborn, but because he knew that seeing it through was the only way to prove he was right. Sal's voice softened. This isn't about Sterling anymore, kid. It was never really about him. It's about that note your dad wrote. It's about proving him right. He left you a legacy of integrity. Don't you dare throw that away because you're tired and scared. David was silent, the words hitting him with the force of truth. Look, Sal continued, you stay home. You take care of your girl. That's your only job today. I'll hold down the fort here. But you think about it. You think about what you want Lily to see when she looks at you. A guy who tried and quit, or a guy who got knocked down, took care of his family, and then got back up to finish the damn fight? Sal hung up without waiting for a reply. David sat with the phone in his hand, his mind reeling. He looked at Lily, who was now sitting up on the couch, coloring in her sketchpad. He had been so focused on the risk of failure that he hadn't considered the cost of quitting. Later that afternoon, while Lily was napping, he walked back into her room to check on her. On her little nightstand, next to a glass of water, was her sketchpad. She had made a new drawing. It was Wrenchman again, but this time he looked tired. He was sitting on a pile of tires, his giant wrench on the ground beside him. But next to him, she had drawn a small stick figure of a girl with a big smile, handing the superhero a heart. Underneath it, in shaky 7-year-old handwriting, she had written, "You can fix it, Daddy." A wave of emotion, so powerful it buckled his knees, washed over him. It wasn't about the cars, or the money, or even the garage. It was about that simple, unshakable faith in his daughter's eyes. He was her hero, and heroes don't quit. A new resolve, harder and clearer than anything he had felt before, settled in his chest. He wasn't just tired, he was fortified. He wasn't just a mechanic, he was a father, and he would not fail. He waited until Lily was sound asleep that night. He kissed her gently on the forehead. Then he walked out of the house and got into his truck. When he pulled up to the garage, the lights were still on. Through the window, he could see Sal, hunched over an engine, a lonely soldier holding the line. David pushed open the door. Sal looked up, startled. Then a slow grin spread across his face. David walked over to the whiteboard. He picked up the black marker and drew a firm, defiant line under the last entry. He looked at Sal, his eyes clear and burning with a renewed fire. "Let's finish this," he said. The final days were a blur of focused, relentless work. The fire of David's renewed determination burned away his fatigue, replacing it with a laser-like intensity. He and Sal worked with a quiet, unspoken synergy, moving around each other in the confined space of the garage like seasoned dance partners. They didn't need to speak much. A pointed finger, a raised eyebrow, a grunt of confirmation was all the communication they needed. The tally on the whiteboard grew steadily, each check mark a small victory, a step closer to the impossible. Car number 42, done. Car number 43, done. Car number 44, done. With 48 hours left on the clock, only 3 cars remained. 2 were standard production models with familiar, heat-related ailments that they now dispatched with practiced efficiency. They had learned the language of Sterling's failures. They knew where to look, what to listen for. They were no longer just fixing cars. They were executing a formula. And then, there was one. The last car was delivered on the morning of the second-to-last day. It arrived alone, on a special, enclosed Sterling transport truck, as if it were a priceless artifact or a contagious patient. When the doors opened, both David and Sal fell silent. It was the Sterling Phantom. It wasn't a production car. It was a myth, a legend whispered about by car enthusiasts and journalists. A one-of-a-kind concept car, built years ago as Jonathan Sterling's personal passion project. It was his vision of the perfect automobile, a symphony of design and power, unburdened by budgets or practicality. It was also a catastrophic, legendary failure. It had never run properly. The file that came with it was thicker than all the others combined, filled with reports of engine fires, catastrophic electronic failures, and the defeated notes of a dozen of Sterling's best engineers. It was the crown jewel of the graveyard, the final, unconquerable boss. It was stunning. The body was a flowing, seamless sculpture of carbon fiber and polished aluminum, painted a shade of silver, so deep it looked liquid. The doors opened upwards like a falcon's wings. It was the most beautiful, and the most intimidating machine David had ever seen. They saved the beast for last, Sal murmured, walking a slow circle around the car. This isn't just a car, kid. This is Sterling's pride. His ego, forged in metal. Embry. They pushed it into the center of the bay, the silent heart of the garage. For the rest of the day, they did nothing but study it. They read every page of the file, absorbing the long and tortured history of its failures. The core problem was the engine, a massive, custom-built V12 that was a masterpiece of engineering on paper, but a nightmare in practice. It was prone to violent, unpredictable backfires and power surges that would fry the car's electronic systems. No one had ever been able to figure out why. As David began his initial inspection, a strange feeling washed over him. He wasn't just looking at an engine, he was having a conversation with its creator. Every design choice, every component, told a story of ambition. The desire for more power, for a smoother ride, for a quieter purr. And in that story, he recognized a familiar antagonist: heat. The V12 was crammed into an engine bay so tight there wasn't a single inch of wasted space. It was a beautiful, dense packaging marvel. It was also an incinerator. The same design flaw from his father's letter, the suffocating insulation, the lack of airflow was present here, but amplified to an insane degree. Sterling, in his pursuit of aesthetic and acoustic perfection, had created the ultimate heat trap. As he worked, his hands moving over the cold metal, he felt an uncanny connection to his own father. He found himself reaching for the tools his dad had favored, his grip falling into the worn spots left by his father's hands. He remembered lessons from his childhood, his dad's voice echoing in his memory. Don't just look at the part, David. Look at what's around it. What's it touching? What's touching it? Everything is connected. He began to trace the engine's systems, not with a computer, but with his fingers and his eyes. He saw how the fuel lines ran perilously close to the custom-molded exhaust manifold. He saw how the main computer was mounted directly to a firewall that, his thermal sensor told him, reached dangerously high temperatures. He was looking at a dozen smaller flaws, all stemming from the one, single, catastrophic sin of ignoring heat dissipation. The core of the problem, he realized, was a fatal harmony of mechanics and software. The engine's timing was controlled by a highly advanced computer that was constantly making micro-adjustments based on data from dozens of sensors. But as the engine bay heated up, the sensors would begin to send slightly inaccurate data readings that were still within their individual acceptable parameters, but that, when combined, were enough to throw the whole system out of sync. The computer, trusting the faulty data, would adjust the engine timing incorrectly. This would cause a small backfire or power surge, which would create a spike of heat, which would make the sensors even less accurate, which would cause the computer to make an even worse adjustment. It was a death spiral, a feedback loop of escalating failure, all happening in the space of microseconds. Sterling's engineers had been trying to fix the software or trying to fix the individual mechanical parts without realizing they were two halves of the same broken whole. The computer is trying to fly the plane while the wings are melting off, David explained to Sal, sketching out the feedback loop on the whiteboard. We can't just fix the software. We have to change the plane. His idea was radical. It went against every principle of modern, computer-controlled engineering. He wasn't going to just fix the heat problem. He was going to give the computer less control. The key was the engine's timing. He proposed making a simple, elegant mechanical adjustment to the camshaft position, advancing it by a few degrees. It was an old-school, analog trick, the kind of thing mechanics did on classic muscle cars. On a modern, computer-controlled engine, it was heresy. It would, in theory, force the engine to run slightly less efficiently at idle, but would make it more stable under load. "You're nuts," Sal said, looking at the diagram. "The computer will fight you every step of the way. It'll try to correct for your adjustment and probably throw the whole thing into chaos." "Not if we tell it not to," David replied, a glint in his eye. "That's part two. We have to recalibrate the software. We'll go into the timing maps and create a wider band of acceptable parameters. We'll teach it to trust the new mechanical baseline, to work with the adjustment, not against it." It was a brilliant, audacious plan. It was treating the car not as a computer with an engine attached, but as a mechanical system with a computer assistant. He was restoring the soul to the machine. The work took them through the night, the last night of their 30-day deadline. David performed the delicate mechanical surgery on the engine's timing gear, his movements precise and confident. Meanwhile, Sal, guided by David's theory, delved deep into the Phantom's source code, a territory where few had dared to tread. He wasn't a programmer, but he understood logic, and he carefully adjusted the values, widening the tolerances, telling the computer to be less of a control freak and more of a trusting partner. As the first pale light of dawn crept into the garage, they were finished. The car was back together. They were exhausted, running on pure adrenaline, their faces pale with fatigue. This was it. Everything came down to this single moment. Lily, who had spent the night sleeping at Sal's apartment, had just arrived, her face full of sleepy concern. She stood by the office door, sensing the monumental tension in the air. David wiped his hands on a rag one last time and walked to the driver's side door. It swung upwards with a soft hiss. He slid into the seat, the custom-molded leather cool against his skin. The cockpit was silent as a tomb. Ed took a deep breath. He looked at Sal, who stood by the workbench, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He looked at Lily, who gave him a small, hopeful smile. He put the key in the ignition. He turned it. The dashboard lit up, the needles swept, the starter engaged, and the massive V12 engine turned over. Where? It coughed once, a sickly, sputtering sound. And then, silence. Dead. A wave of absolute, crushing despair washed over David. His heart felt like a stone in his chest. He had failed. After everything, after all the work, he had failed. He stared through the windshield, seeing nothing. "Try it again," Sal said, his voice quiet but steady. "Let the fuel pump prime." David closed his eyes for a second, drawing on his last reserves of hope. He couldn't give up. Not now. He turned the key back, then forward again. Whir. This time, there was a deeper rumble. A spark caught, then another. A ragged, uneven roar filled the garage, the car shaking violently. It sounded like it was tearing itself apart. "Shut it down," Sal yelled. But David kept his hand steady. He listened. Beneath the chaos, he heard a new rhythm struggling to be born. He gently feathered the accelerator, giving the engine just a little fuel. The ragged roar began to smooth out. The violent shaking lessened. The rhythm found its footing. And then, suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped, the chaos resolved into perfect harmony. The engine settled into a low, menacing, and utterly flawless idle. The sound was a deep, resonant purr, the sound of immense power held in perfect check. It was the most beautiful sound David had ever heard. He let out a shaky breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He looked at Sal. The old mechanic's face was split by a grin so wide it looked like it hurt, his eyes shining with unshed tears of pride and disbelief. David looked toward the door and saw Lily, her hands clasped over her mouth, her eyes dancing with joy. He had done it. He hadn't just fixed the unfixable car. He had vindicated his father. He had conquered the Phantom. He slowly revved the engine, and the pure, magnificent roar that filled the garage was not a sound of defiance. It was a sound of rebirth. The morning of the 30th day dawned bright and clear. The air outside Legacy Auto was still, but it vibrated with an invisible, triumphant energy. On the freshly swept asphalt of the lot, a miracle was parked. 47 Sterling automobiles sat in silent, perfect rows. They had been driven out of the garage one by one, their engines humming with a smoothness they hadn't possessed since they left the factory. Sal and David had spent the last hours of the night cleaning and polishing each one, removing every trace of grease and grime. They weren't just repaired cars, they were trophies. Gleaming sentinels, powerful apexes, and fiery falcons sat shoulder to shoulder, a silent army awaiting its final review. At the head of the formation, parked closest to the garage door, was the Sterling Phantom, its liquid silver body seeming to drink the morning light. Inside, the garage was quiet. The whiteboard, covered in check marks, stood as a testament to their impossible feat. David, Sal, and Lily sat on overturned crates, sipping coffee, and in Lily's case, hot chocolate in a state of exhausted, happy silence. They had done it. There was nothing left to do but wait. At precisely 10 o'clock, a car appeared at the end of the street. It wasn't a sleek, black Sterling sedan or an imposing company SUV. It was a vintage Sterling 300 SL Gullwing, from the 1952nd, a true classic, painted a stunning shade of racing green. The car itself was a statement. It spoke not of corporate power, but of genuine passion. The gull wing pulled up and parked across the street. The wing door swung upwards, and Jonathan Sterling emerged. He wasn't wearing an immaculate suit or a casual polo shirt. He was dressed like a car enthusiast on a weekend drive. Simple trousers, a leather driving jacket, and soft-soled shoes. He looked different, less like a CEO and more like a man. He didn't look at the garage or at the people waiting there. His entire focus was on the parade of automobiles parked in the lot. He stood for a long moment, completely still, simply taking in the sight. He walked slowly down the first row, his expression unreadable. He ran a hand lightly over the hood of a Sentinel, the same way David had done in the graveyard a month before. He peered into the window of the Falcon, the car with the resurrected transmission module. David watched him, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. This was the moment of reckoning. Finally, Sterling stopped in front of the Phantom. He stared at it, his face a mixture of awe, disbelief, and something else David couldn't quite identify, something that looked like regret. He circled it once, then reached out and gently touched the hood, right over the V12 engine that now beat with a steady, perfect heart. He turned, his piercing blue eyes finally meeting David's. He walked across the asphalt, his gaze never wavering, and stopped a few feet in front of David, Sal, and Lily. "How?" Sterling asked. His voice wasn't loud or demanding. It was quiet, filled with a genuine, profound need to understand. David had prepared for this moment. He had rehearsed angry speeches, triumphant declarations. But looking at the man before him, he saw not a vanquished foe, but someone who was finally ready to listen. "You stopped listening to the cars," David said, his voice steady. "You were too busy listening to the computers, the spreadsheets, and the focus groups. You engineered the soul out of them." He walked over to the Phantom. "This car," he said, patting its fender, "it's a masterpiece. But you tried to make it perfect, and in doing so, you broke it. You wrapped the engine so tight it couldn't breathe. You prioritized silence over stability. You created a feedback loop of failure because you were chasing an impossible ideal." Sterling listened, his face impassive, but his eyes were locked on David, absorbing every word. David gestured to the rows of cars behind him. "They all have the same problem, in different ways. A fatal flaw woven into their DNA, a design philosophy that creates a heat trap, cooking the components from the inside out." He paused, then walked back to the garage, disappearing into the office for a moment. He returned holding a thin, yellowed sheet of paper. He held it out to Sterling. "You were warned," David said quietly. Sterling took the paper. His hands, David noticed, were not entirely steady. He recognized it instantly. The letter from Frank Miller. He read the words he had dismissed as the ramblings of a grease monkey 20 years ago. This time, they didn't sound simplistic. They sounded prophetic. "You are building cars with a fatal flaw." Sterling looked up from the letter, his gaze distant. "He was right," he whispered, more to himself than to David. All this time, he was right. He looked around at the 47 perfect cars, then back at David, and finally at the small garage with the faded sign. A fortress of integrity he had tried, and failed, to conquer. "I built an empire on the idea of precision," Sterling said, his voice thick with a self-awareness that had been absent a month ago. "I thought passion was a variable that needed to be controlled. I thought craftsmanship was inefficient. I measured success in stock points and market share. I forgot what it felt like to simply build a great car." Oh, he looked at David, and for the first time, the corporate mask was gone completely. In its place was a man humbled, a man reckoning with the ghost of his own ambition. "I was wrong," he said. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a profound corporate and personal admission. "I was wrong about your father, and I was wrong about you." He let out a long, slow breath. "The contract is yours, of course. Legacy Auto will be the exclusive, top-tier service center for all of Sterling's most difficult cases. You can name your price." He paused, then took a step closer. "But that's not enough. That's a bandage, just like your father said. I'm not interested in having you fix my mistakes anymore, Mr. Miller. I need you to help me stop making them." The offer, when it came, was more than David could have imagined. I am officially creating a new department at Sterling Automotive, Sterling announced, the Quality and Innovation Division. It will operate independently of R&D and design. It will have the power to veto any design choice that sacrifices mechanical integrity for aesthetics. It will answer to no one but me, and I want you to run it. David was stunned into silence. He looked at Sal, whose jaw had dropped. He looked at Lily, who was beaming, her faith in her father absolute and justified. Head of a division at Sterling Automotive? It was unthinkable. You can write your own salary, Sterling continued, pressing his advantage. You'll have your own budget, your own team. You can bring him with you, he said, nodding respectfully at Sal. I want the soul of this garage. He swept a hand to indicate Legacy Auto. In the heart of my company. It was everything he could have dreamed of. Financial security for Lily, the resources to truly make a difference, the ultimate validation. He looked at the old, faded sign on his garage. Legacy Auto. He had fought to save it. He couldn't abandon it now. I accept, David said, his voice clear and strong. On one condition. Sterling raised an eyebrow. Legacy Auto stays open, David stated. It doesn't become some Sterling-branded boutique. It stays just like this. Sal will run it with a new team of apprentices. And on weekends, I'll still be here, getting my hands dirty. Every executive and every design engineer at Sterling Automotive, including Dr. Thorne, will be required to spend 1 week a year working here in this garage, not observing, working. They need to be reminded of where the rubber actually meets the road. He was expecting a negotiation, an argument. Instead, Sterling smiled. It was the first genuine, unforced smile David had ever seen from him. It transformed his face, erasing years of tension. A legacy is worth preserving, Sterling said, and a lesson is worth learning. It's a brilliant condition. Done. He held out his hand. David took it, and they shook firmly. It was more than a business deal. It was a truce. It was the merging of two worlds. It was the quiet, respectful passing of a torch, not from father to son, but from one generation's philosophy to the next. As Sterling turned to leave, he paused beside the gull wing and looked back at David. Your father would be proud of you, Mr. Miller, he said. I know, David replied, a quiet confidence in his voice. He would be proud of both of us for finally getting it right. 6 months later, the boardroom for Sterling's newly formed Quality and Innovation Division felt nothing like Jonathan Sterling's penthouse office. The room was bright, functional, and dominated by a massive, interactive smart screen instead of a panoramic view. There were no mahogany desks or minimalist art. Instead, the walls were lined with whiteboards covered in complex schematics, and a disassembled engine block sat on a clean, rolling stand in the corner, a permanent, tactile reminder of their true purpose. David Miller stood at the head of the conference table. He wore a simple, dark blue Sterling polo shirt, the company logo stitched neatly on the chest. But if you looked closely, you could still see a faint, stubborn trace of grease under one of his fingernails, a mark he no longer bothered to scrub away. It was a badge of honor. On the large screen behind him was a 3D rendering of a new V8 engine, slated for the next generation of Sterling sedans. Seated around the table were the company's top engineers, including a humbled and noticeably more attentive Dr. Eris Thorne. Here, David said, using a stylus to circle a small, tightly packed area near the transmission housing. This is the pinch point. Your simulations say the heat will dissipate, but the simulation doesn't account for 5 hours of stop-and-go traffic on a hot day. It's the same philosophy that led to the graveyard. He didn't say it with accusation, but with the calm authority of a teacher. He tapped the screen, and his own modification appeared a subtle redesign of the housing and the addition of 2 small, cleverly hidden ventilation channels. This adds 3 grams to the overall weight, David explained, and it costs an extra $7 per unit in manufacturing. But it will increase the lifespan of the transmission's electronic module by an estimated 70%. It's the difference between a car that lasts and a car that's a liability. Doctor, Thorne leaned forward, studying the modification. 6 months ago, he would have dismissed the idea out of hand as crude and inefficient. Now, he just nodded slowly. He's right, Thorne said to the rest of the team. It's a more robust design. Implement it. David had not just been given a title, he had been given a voice. And the entire company was learning to listen. He had spent the last 6 months not just reviewing new designs, but building bridges. He translated the theoretical genius of the engineers into the practical reality of the mechanics who would one day have to service the cars. He brought the soul of legacy auto into the sterile heart of Sterling Tower. On Saturday, that soul was exactly where it had always been. The sun streamed through the open doors of Legacy Auto, illuminating the familiar, happy chaos within. The garage was thriving. Sal, his scowl now a permanent fixture of feigned grumpiness, was loudly instructing two young apprentices, both fresh from a local technical college. They were the first recipients of the Sterling Legacy Scholarship, a program David had established to foster a new generation of skilled craftspeople. "No, no, no," Sal barked, pointing at a torque wrench. "You don't guess. You listen for the click. The wrench is smarter than you are. Let it do its job." The young mechanic grinned, unfazed by Sal's gruff exterior. They all knew that beneath it, he was the most patient teacher they'd ever had. David was there too. He was kneeling on the clean concrete, his sterling polo shirt already smudged with a bit of dirt. He wasn't the head of a corporate division right now. He was just a dad. In front of him was a small electric go-kart he had built for Lily. "Okay, you see this chain?" he said, pointing. "It needs to be tight, but not too tight, like a firm handshake. See?" Lily, now a proud 8-year-old, nodded seriously, her brow furrowed in concentration as she tested the chain's tension with her small finger. "Like a firm handshake," she repeated, committing the lesson to memory. Her superhero drawings had been replaced by sketches of gear systems and engine parts. A familiar, throaty rumble turned their heads. A classic racing green gullwing pulled up and parked quietly across the street. Jonathan Sterling got out. He wasn't there for a meeting or an inspection. He was carrying a cardboard tray with 2 coffees and a small hot chocolate. He walked over, nodding a greeting to Sal and the apprentices. He handed the hot chocolate to Lily, who gave him a brilliant smile. "Thanks, Mr. Sterling." "Oh, call me Jonathan, Lily," he said, his own smile easy and genuine. He handed a coffee to David, then leaned against the workbench next to him, the two men looking at the go-kart. "How's the new prototype review going?" David asked. "Better, thanks to you," Sterling replied. "Thorne actually used the phrase robust mechanical integrity in a meeting yesterday. I almost fell out of my chair." They shared a laugh, the easy laugh of friends who had been through a battle together and come out stronger on the other side. Sterling looked around the bustling garage, at the young apprentices learning a trade, at Sal holding court, at David teaching his daughter. "You know," he said quietly, "for 30 years I thought legacy was about the name you build, the empire, the stock price." He took a sip of his coffee. "I was wrong. It's not about what you build. It's about what you leave behind that can continue to build after you're gone. The skill, the integrity, the people." David looked at Lily, who was now confidently tightening a bolt on her cart's wheel, her movements mimicking her father's. He looked at the bright, eager faces of the apprentices. He looked at the faded sign above the door. A new legacy. He had fought to save his father's legacy, and in doing so, had created something far greater. He hadn't just fixed 47 cars. He had helped fix a broken company, and in the process, had shown a billionaire the true meaning of value. He had secured his daughter's future not just with money, but with the far more valuable inheritance of purpose, passion, and the simple, powerful knowledge that with the right tools and enough heart, anything can be fixed. David Miller proved that true genius isn't always found in the boardroom, and that the most important legacy is the wisdom we pass on. He didn't just win a contract, he sparked a revolution, reminding an entire company that its heart wasn't in its balance sheets, but in the hum of a perfectly tuned engine. Thank you for joining us on this Up story. We hope it inspired you. If you enjoyed this journey, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an uplifting tale. What did you think of David's journey? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. Until next time, keep looking for the stories that lift us all up.